Okay, so now what we're going to have a look at is we're going to start to have a rather long chat about consumer behaviour and the purchasing cycle. And when we start to consider that, what we're really talking about is the inquiry into the process of individuals and how they, or even groups or organisations, and how it is that they go about finding, selecting and securing the goods and services they want, and then thinking about how that's going to satisfy their needs, wants and desires. All right, so it's about the decision-making process. We start to look at a little bit of psychology, we start to think a little bit about sociology, and there's also social anthropology, so the bigger parts of human habits and behaviours, and thinking about how that starts to affect their wants and desires, where they're going, what they're doing, why they make the decisions they do, and when they make those decisions and what sort of drives that. Because once we start to understand that, we can begin to influence it and also position ourselves best to take advantage of the fact that there's a known behaviour. Right, so we really start to get an idea into how those individuals or groups come up with their plans and then go into it. So really what we're looking at is, how can we use that to our best advantage? If we understand what people are doing and when they're doing it, well, how can I place myself within my marketing cycle and my marketing mix to make the most of that? We know that, people go Monday to Friday and Friday night they go out for drinks. Great. If I'm a nightclub, I need to be, hey, they go out on drinks for Fridays. When am I going to put my promotional stuff? I'll put it on Thursday so that on Friday they know where to go. Or I'll advertise it on Tuesday so they've got enough time to plan and go to it, whatever it happens to be. Okay, so we're looking at those natural things people do or organisations do and then get in on it. 30th June every year, we know in Australia that's the end of financial year cycle. There's a massive ramp up of spending as people buy office supplies. So if I'm in office supplies and stationery, I put a massive amount of advertising campaign in May, all right, ready to go. So that's what we're starting to talk about here. All right, so how do we position, what's happening in their cycle, and where are we going to interact with that is really the thrust of what we're doing. So once we understand it, we can make some really good predictions on what they're going to be doing. We can capitalise on that and make sure that we're really making the most we can. So the first thing we have to look at there, I guess, is to understand, well, the person that sits in the middle of this whole tree is the consumer. Okay? So the consumer is the person we're trying to understand, the consumer is the person we're trying to influence, and the consumer is the sort of person we're going to start to deal with. So we need to start thinking about, well, what's shaping them? And the first one is we start to think about individual... Okay, so we start thinking about, well, what are the individual influences there? Okay, that starts to go in. So what are their individual influences? So what drives them? What about the organisation they work with or work for? Okay, what does that shape? Okay, so my personal preferences, my personal tastes and the things that I like, friends, family, whatever. First, the organisation I might work for might also shape some of my decision-making process. And then that turns into a couple of different levels or a couple of different activities. The first one is how do they then obtain what they're looking for, okay? So where do they get it from? How are they going to purchase or how are they going to make the transaction? The next thing is after I've thought about, well, how are they going to get a hold of my goods or services, what are they going to do with the goods and services? And that's when we start looking at consuming. Okay, how do they consume those goods and services? All right, is it a food product? Is it, is it toner from my printer that it's going to take me 12 months to go through? Is it I quickly, take this, I use it, buy petrol, I burn petrol and I drive my car? Okay, what are they doing here when we're talking about consumption? Okay, how are they moving through the product or how are they using it? And then lastly, we get to the last bit, which is about disposal. Okay, what do they do with the end of it? Okay, so when I'm thinking about my cycle, well, how do they get rid of the goods and services at the end? Okay, so, if I put it down to Domino's, I want to buy a pizza, how do I obtain it? What's my process? What's my preferred way of getting a hold of that pizza? Consuming a pizza. Now, okay, yeah, they eat it, yeah, but are they eating it with friends? Are they eating it in front of the TV? Are they eating it on a Friday night with a bunch of, what's the pattern or what's actually taking place other than the most obvious? And then what happens with the box? What happens with all the packaging? What happens with everything else at the end? That becomes a thing there. If it's a car, it might be I've obtained a car, I've used a car for a couple of years, and then what about my resale? Okay, so I need to think about the cycle as the complete cycle from when they get it in to when they get rid of it. All right, so probably the first thing we'll start to look at then is we'll get into the individual influences. Okay, what are we talking about with individual influences? Well, there's a lot of things that can go into that. First will be the culture, okay, so the background of where the person comes from, where they live, what's taking place, okay, culturally. I know that, it doesn't even have to be in a national, it could be in a localised culture as well. When I was a kid, I lived in, South Sydney or southeastern Sydney, and therefore you went for the local football team. You went for South Sydney Rabbitohs, and if you didn't, there was a problem, okay? It was just culturally ingrained that that's what you did. Support your local team, do your local things, okay? Those things come into it as well, not just the macro. Okay, when we then talk about it, we might talk about ethnicity, so that is starting to look at the national background, etc. I hate to be all cliched, but yes, we've put the shrimps on the barbie. I like barbecues and all that sort of very Australian thing. That's just a lot of what we do. It doesn't mean it's always the case, and it is a stereotype, but these things do influence to some degree. Personality comes into it as well. Okay, differing personality types, whether the person's outgoing, whether they're an introvert, extrovert, whether they, whatever they happen to be doing in their life. Their family is going to influence that as well. So how big is the family? What's their interaction with the family? Do they have their own family? What's the size of it, etc. We need to think about their life stage. Okay, so when we're talking about life stage, are they, a child? Have they moved into teenage years? Are they now moving onto the sort of the higher levels to old age, whatever it happens to be? We also might talk about their values. Okay, so what are the values they hold? And if we're thinking about political parties, we might talk about, do they look at virtues of honesty? Do they look at, integrity? What is it that they're looking at that they're very interested in, and how's that going to help them? Income levels also are a factor there. Okay, so how much disposable income they might have. Do they have plenty? Do they have a little bit? Okay, what's going to happen on that? Moving forward to that is attitudes and opinions. Okay, so, their general attitude and outlook on life, their opinions, whether they look at popular opinion or whether they have their own fringe opinion. How motivated is the person becomes another one. If you're running a gym, understanding the motivation of your target market. Do you want to lose weight? Do you want to do this? Do you want to get out the door? What do you want to do? And trying to change that becomes very important. Past experience starts to influence it. Okay, if people use your product or service in the past and it's been good, they'll be happily come back. If they've used your product or services or even a competitor's product or service and it wasn't so great, they might not be so keen to come back. They might go, that was enough. Feelings, peer groups and their friends, okay, so how their friends look at stuff, and also thinking about their underlying knowledge. How much knowledge do they have about your goods and services? Not just you specifically, but even across the types of goods and services you offer and some of your competitors. All right, so that starts to talk about a whole lot of things there that we need to think about, individual influences. That's got to be at least a good dozen things you need to have in your mind all at once, and there's a lot to track there. But understanding where this person is and where that market is coming from is the crucial first part of this. Okay,